Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and taking a bit of a break in your afternoon's events. So the topic of today is middle powers geostrategy. How are ascending middle powers writing their own geoeconomic strategies to shape the 21st century? It seems to me that there are two underlying questions that are subsumed into this one. The first is, what on earth is a middle power, and is it even a relevant construct? Particularly in a world in which we're talking about unipolar moments and multipolar moments. Is it relevant? And the second one is, what is geoeconomics? And we talk about geostrategy, but geoeconomics is a relatively new field. So what is geoeconomics? So to explain to us some of this and to explore where the world is going in this respect, I have a great panelist. John Walker, he founded Oxford Economics, which is the preeminent geoeconomics research and consulting company, in around 40 years ago and continues to chair it. But he's also had some experience in government, in the British Treasury, a number of years ago, and in European government. So here's a man who knows what it's like to sit in the private sector, but also knows what it's like to be in government. So let me start, John, with the questions I set out. Is middle powers even a useful way to think about the world? I mean, we've been talking about it on and on today. Does it help us? And if not, how do you think about framing conversations when you're excluding, as it were, the big powers?
First, it's great to be here. It's my second visit to Saudi Arabia, and things have changed dramatically since I was last here in 2018. In terms of your question, I don't find the concept of middle powers awfully useful. I see the world as being a couple of great powers, the US and China. There's then a second tier of a number of countries within the G20, the top of the G20. And then there's a number of countries a little bit lower down. Saudi Arabia would definitely be included in that, as would Indonesia, Turkey, even India. But they're all very different countries with very different aims, very different economies, very different political systems as well. So I'm not terribly convinced that it's a useful thing to categorize all those countries together. They're all trying to grow very rapidly. They're all trying to develop their economies in different ways. And there's an interesting contrast between them. But to put them all together, I think, can be not terribly useful.
So do you have a preferred framework? I mean, do you have a preferred way of breaking down countries in a way that is useful for your clients?
Not in that sort of way, anyway. I think what we try to emphasize is the difference between countries, that there are similarities across the world about what companies do and what consumers do, but the important thing is to understand the differences between them, because only then would we be able to operate in the private sector in particular in those countries. You need to understand the political system, you need to understand the different structures of those economies, and only in that way can you hope to succeed.
So before I move on to economics, let me just pick up that idea of differences. What do you see as the kind of 2 or 3 key differentiators or trends that you can use to emphasize the differences between, say, Turkey and Indonesia or Saudi Arabia, Argentina? What are you seeing as differentiators rather than as trends that are bringing powers together, if you will?
Yes, it's difficult to generalize, but let's just take Saudi Arabia in particular. Here, obviously, being such a large oil producer, being able to produce oil at a relatively cheap price, the money they're making from that is allowing them to invest in education, which is extremely important, to invest in infrastructure, which is extremely important, and also to develop new industries, which is very important. Indonesia would be very different. It has coal, but coal is not likely to last anywhere near as long as oil. It doesn't have the same money to invest in any of the things that Saudi Arabia has, and therefore is likely to find life a good deal more difficult.
So I think you make a really important point here, and I've pushed you a little bit on it, which is we love to make generalizations. It's the way that our brains work, is we put things into boxes, and what I'm hearing from you is you just can't do that in this space.
I don't think so. I don't find that terribly useful, and I don't think our clients do. What they want to understand is the differences. And again, they don't want to just understand what's going to happen going forward. They want to understand the risks and uncertainties about that. As an economist, we're all asked to give numbers. There was things on the screen yesterday saying growth was 7.15%. Basically, growth was just over 7% would be a much better way of thinking about it. And what is the range about that is what people want to know when whether they're in government or whether they're in business.
I think it's fascinating. We tend to think of economics or economists as wanting to be very exact. And what I'm hearing you say is, you can't do that. You have to think in terms of ranges. You have to think in terms of probabilities. But let me move slightly, if I can, and get to the economics. I was having a conversation last week, and the person I was talking with says geoeconomics is absolutely transformed over the last 2 decades. Industrial policy, the use of subsidies, the use of tariffs has really taken off. So can you tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about, how do you see the geoeconomics context changing? And can you make generalizations like that, or is it a bit like the geopolitics?
I think it's a little bit the same. I think
You're not making life easy for people here, are you?
I'm sorry, but life isn't easy. Maybe that's one of the things that economists have got to accept. They love to be able to say, we know exactly what's going to go on, but the reality is that we don't. And as a company, we find that's what people really want to hear. So I don't think it's the wrong thing to do, but I agree that for people like you, it makes life a bit more difficult, but that's the way the world is.
So let me get into specifics, if I may. Let's assume for one moment that I'm a Middle Eastern, I'm a Saudi business, and I'm looking to go international. What would you say to me? Or I don't have to be a Saudi business, you choose. But what's the kind of thing that you would be telling me now as I'm looking to maybe invest in the United States, or I'm looking to invest in China, perhaps?
I think one of the things that we stress to all companies is understand the economies that you're going into and what the differences are, and again, the similarities between them. And on that particular point between the US and China, many of our clients come along to us and say, China's already far bigger than the US and is growing at X% per annum. Isn't that the one place we need to focus on? And what we say to them is, well, no, the way people present those numbers is often very misleading. The example I mentioned to you earlier was GDP in the US this year, according to our calculations, will be about $27 trillion, a big number for us all to take on board. China's big, but it will only be about $18 trillion. So the US is 50% bigger than China in terms of its overall economy. And even in 10 years' time, China will still be smaller than the US on most projections that we make. Taking consumer spending, the disparity is even bigger. US consumer spending is about 18 trillion. China's less than half that. So if you're thinking of where you're going to get tourists to come to, again, a country like this, look to the US, because they're the people that have got the money to spend. And the vice versa, if you think about investment. China's investing a lot more than the US, so if you're involved in steel or metal goods or things like that, look to China, because that market's much bigger than the US.
How do countries like Saudi Arabia, these, putting aside the fact we don't like the construct middle powers, but how do countries like Saudi Arabia compete against the, or with the, maybe against is the wrong word, with the superpowers of the US and China? What advice would you give?
I think that's an interesting question, and we often try and help countries like this look at it. One of the things that I start by saying is, we had South Korea here yesterday. South Korea did the classic thing of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s of investing in industry, because that was the thing to do, and there was a lot of opportunities there. And we saw Japan, Vietnam, even China more recently, do very well in terms of manufacturing. We'd say now to countries and companies that are in those smaller areas, trying to compete in manufacturing is very, very difficult. At the low end, low wage end, you've got very low wages in Vietnam or China, very difficult to compete. High-end manufacturing, you've got Germany and Japan, very difficult to compete. So look to other areas. Don't just focus on manufacturing. And I think that's what we like about here in Saudi Arabia. They've seen they need to look at tourism, they need to look at sports. There's a large number of other parts of the economy, more service-orientated, that countries in that middle grouping, however we want to label them, will do far better.
So what I'm hearing you say is, and this is an old adage, but find your competitive advantage, find your niche.
Absolutely. And Saudi might have a competitive advantage in downstream from oil for obvious reasons, but it's unlikely to have a competitive advantage in machine tools. It's unlikely to have a competitive advantage in silicon chips, something like that. Equally, another area it might do well in would be things like green energy. You've got a lot of sunlight here.
So, beautiful segue. How is technology going to change the kind of equations that you're talking about, if at all, or the kind of thinking, strategic thinking that you're talking about?
That's the question we're spending a lot of time on.
You have the answers. You're the man.
No, we don't. I mean, the other thing is to say we don't have the answers. My personal view is that AI, for example, is extremely important, but I don't think it'll be quite so transformative as some people are suggesting at this conference. That's my personal view. I think that's just because it always takes companies and individuals a lot longer to adapt to them. If you look at the overall performance of economies, it's hard to see that the internet made any difference. For example, I know but just because it took some time. It didn't happen in 2001, 2002 when we all started. It actually took companies quite a few years for that to feed through into the macroeconomic data. So maybe I'm a bit of a cynic, but I always think that the idea that things are going to be transformative can be a little bit overdone. Doesn't mean it won't matter, but it won't matter in 2024.
So we're running out of time. So let me finish with one question, which is, we've got a whole load of people here from the private sector and from government. If you had one message, we've talked a certain amount about both, but if you had one message for government, if they want to create the right context for private sector investment, what is the one thing that they ought to do? And vice versa, what is the one thing that the private sector needs to do if it wants to get the kind of investment and support from government? What should they be asking for?
I think from government, there's two things they should do. Firstly, stability. I think any company wants to operate in an environment in which they've got reasonable certainty that the government won't dramatically change policy from one day to the next. We saw a very bad example of that in the UK last year when we had government stopping and changing.
I'm trying to forget. Move on.
Yeah. But the other thing would be data. They want to know what's going on. And I think one of the things that we're talking about here in Saudi Arabia, one of the problems that countries like China have, is getting good information about what the economy is doing. It may be revised, it may still be not the total story, but companies want to know what's happening to the economy around them, and they need to have data and information to do that. And hopefully they buy from us to interpret that information.
So what I hear from you, again, is understand your context.
Yeah.
And your context is specific. It's not generic.
Exactly. Yeah.
John, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Nice to talk to you.